thing I would ask you is if you could please ask questions, the answer to which at least one other person in the room would be interested in, if you don't mind. I'm doing that to filter out the type of questions I sometimes get, which are incredibly detailed. Yeah, there's somebody there who needs a mic.
Hello, Brian. So you're probably best known for your work with pop music, maybe? Would you agree? I was going to ask, how has your interest in generative music informed the way that you've worked with pop music and the pop form?
Not all that much, to tell you the truth. They're really rather different activities. As I was saying earlier about when I used the analogy of architecture. So making music in traditional ways is a little bit like being an architect, and making a record, a pop record, is a little bit like that. Where you're worrying about each moment in the process and whether that should be a little bit louder and so on and so on. So you're working a lot of the time in detail, and what we're doing here is different from architecture. It's more like gardening, is always my analogy. So what we're really doing is making something that is like a box of seeds, and each time you use one of these things, it's like planting the seed and seeing how it grows on that particular occasion, and not trying to stop it being what it becomes, letting it be that particular thing this particular time. So there isn't, to be honest, much crossover, though I could bluff and pretend there was, but there isn't.
I think there's actually potential for something like that to happen. At present, one of the reasons I think I've been drawn to ambient music is it's a particularly good fit for generative music. But in principle, actually, you could have very complex chord structures. The difficulty is vocalists, that they don't tend to like being wired into computers very much. But the backing could work.
Yeah. Another one over here, please.
I was wondering if you'd ever consider selling your system empty so that users can put their own sound libraries in.
That seems like a good idea, but in fact, it's not as easy as you'd think to find the right sounds. So the craft of composing in a case like this becomes, as I said earlier, two things: designing the system, but also designing the inputs to it. And that turns out to be quite a lot harder than it seems. I mean, I'm not particularly averse to somebody else having the system. Are you? What do you think?
No, I think
you designed it, mate. Up to you.
It'd be interesting to see what someone else could do with it. But in terms of writing software that was that open-ended, I think it feels less appealing to me. What's been very enjoyable about doing Bloom, Trope, and Scape, and Air, for that matter, is it's having very, very small teams and being able to move fast and respond sort of fairly quickly, if you can call the 2 years of development quickly.
We are the team, actually.
As soon as you've got something that's got to cater for every situation, then there's a lot more complexity to actually developing the software in the first place, although we don't have the stress of designing the sounds. And I think also you lose one of the things that's been so nice about doing Bloom and Scape, which is that it actually is very open. You need no musical skill whatsoever. With Bloom in particular, we've seen videos of sort of 6-month-old babies using it. With Scape, actually, I am getting reports of young children using it as well. And that, in neither case, that's not what we intended with it, actually. It's just been a very nice side effect. I think in Bloom it's particularly bizarre that we sort of tried to write a sort of abstract piece of art and came up with a great child amuser.
Happens to me all the time. There's two hands at the back there. It's a stereo question.
Yes, I was saying that I've read things that you've written about how music could get out of this materialization phase that it is in. And in fact, we could imagine even pop music having elements of generative music in it. I was wondering how you feel about the intensity of the experience that you get out of a 5-minute thing, as of, you compared with a generative piece of music.
You're talking about a pop record as opposed to a long piece like this, do you mean? So he's asking about duration of experience. Well, I don't know. I don't know about you, but I think of them as different types of experience. When I put one of these kinds of pieces on, I'm really listening as a different kind of listener. It's a little bit like the difference between reading a short story and a novel. If you read a novel, you sort of settle down for the long run, and you want to get very interested in the characters, and you want to know a lot about them. And you know that it's an experience that you're going to go away from and return to over a period of time. Whereas you're not likely to do that with a 3.5-minute pop song. Pop off and come back to catch the chorus. Though I used to do this thing when I was doing my installations a lot. I used to be able to go to sleep during the day, and I could fall asleep at the beginning of a verse and wake up before the end of the verse. And that's how I used to do cat naps, and I found it amazing that you could sleep for 7 or 8 seconds and feel quite refreshed. Yeah, sorry, that was completely irrelevant.
Well, and one reason I think sort of ambient music and ambient generative music sort of particularly, you can listen to it for very long periods of time, I think, is it often takes on the character more of a sort of perfume hanging in the air rather than necessarily a concrete sort of narrative or piece of music. And I've found certainly testing Scape and the other apps that I've been able to keep them on for very long periods of time. And there's a phrase of Brian's that I keep coming back to, that the music should be as ignorable as it is interesting. And I think that really works, this type of music, and it's a very important characteristic of it.
Yes, and I would say the other thing is how you think about music in functional terms. Now, all of us use music, actually. You have to compare the situation we're in now with the situation 140 years ago, say, where any individual listener would be very, very lucky if they ever heard the same piece twice. So, if you were very interested in music, you might hear Beethoven's Fifth Symphony 4 or 6 times in your life. Well, now we can hear pieces thousands of times. So, and not only that, we have the experience of music nearly all the time around us. We're always listening to music. Can you imagine what it was like in the early 20th century when German marching bands would go and visit a little rural village in Somerset, and their visit would be talked about for weeks in advance? And they would set up and play for an hour, and everyone was very excited, and then they'd go away for another 6 months. Can you imagine what it was like to have such a rare experience of music in your life? And now we have this almost continuous experience of music. So in a way, I think one of the things that ambient music is responding to is the idea of, well, if we're going to have continuous music, let's at least think about that. Let's at least think about what you need in a piece of music if it's going to have a duration of 1 or 2 or 6 hours. And that was kind of the starting point of thinking about ambient music for me, of what's the difference between listening to something for a short time, a one-off that is like a compact experience, and for a long time. And I think one of the sort of successes of ambient music has been with writers and artists. A lot of writers and artists I know like having this music playing when they're working, because in a sense, it sort of emotionally stabilizes an environment, is the way I think of it. It keeps you in a certain place emotionally, instead of having the radio on where your emotions are being changed every 4 minutes. Yeah, there's a lady here.
Hello, Brian. I really love your work. Just wanted to ask you, when composing music, in your view, where it's intelligent music, what would come first, rational thought or creative instinct?
Well, I think this is quite interesting. It's an interesting part of our working relationship as well, because we're both artists, and to some extent we're both thinking about technology as well. I mean, he's better at it than me, for sure, but but we both think about how to do interesting things with technology. So that means that we're both used to switching frame all the time. And what I find myself doing is thinking of a possibility, thinking, oh, you could do this. And often that's a technical possibility to do with the way a sound is made or something like that. I think you could do this. And then I do it, I make it. And then I think, oh, that sounds kind of nice. And then I'm sucked into it on a different level. I'm no longer thinking technically then. I'm thinking emotionally or artistically, if you like, aesthetically. So I'm quite happy to always be going back and forth between these frames. And I think our conversations really are really the two of us taking one of those positions and batting back and forth between them.
I think everything in Bloom, Scape, Trope actually has all been part of that process. That sort of often it's a pattern of one or the other is suggesting an idea, and then sort of say Brian will say, "But could it do this?" Then I realize, well, it can do that, but that means it can also do this as well.
Yes.
And that process tends to sort of expand enormously for a while until you have loads of things, and then you just sort of strip away most of it in the end and end up with what idea out of all of that sort of really worked. I mean, with Scape, we've probably thrown away about 3/4 of the ideas we've had, and even that was built on top of other ideas that didn't quite make it as well. I think it's almost like sort of sculpture in some ways. You're just constantly refining what you've got.
I feel quite strongly that the resistance that artists often have to being articulate is self-defeating. You know, there's a lot of artists don't like to analyze the way they make their work because they're worried that they'll burst the bubble. It's got to be a kind of magical process for them. But my own experience is that thinking about it pays off. The more you think about it, the stronger your next starting point is. You can cancel out a lot of things. You can start somewhere fresh and new like that. To not think about it at all sort of condemns you to constantly going round in the same circles, I think. You need ways to disorientate yourself, to shock yourself out of habits. Like Peter was saying earlier, that we've built that into Scape, actually. There are ways of disturbing your equilibrium so that you're not going to very quickly get into routines with it, we hope. I'll tell you what I should ask. If there are any questions since this is supposed to be for developers as well, if there are any developers who specifically want to ask developer-y questions. Okay, there's one here.
Do you take a test-driven approach to development? And if so, how far do you go with the indeterminate aspects of it?
Do we take a test-driven approach? What does that mean, actually? I don't know that.
I presume by that you mean, do we just test out the software and on sort of a wider audience first, perhaps?
Well, no, the unit testing. Do you write tests on the software to make sure it's still working as you develop it?
Now, I know I should. I'm afraid this is where I cling to the artist part of the word. I like to enjoy myself when I write software too. So, no, Scape is not ISO 9000 compliant, I'm afraid.
What does that mean? Does it matter? No, it doesn't matter.
Probably not in the real world.
No. We testing really is him and me playing it and saying, I don't like this bit very much. This bit's really good. Can we make more of those? Last question. Who shall it be, a developer or a non-developer?
Non-developer.
I don't know how to choose. I'll let the lady with the microphone choose.
Brian, Peter. Just want to say, very inspiring work. Love the Scape program. In the underground here in London, they use classical music to keep the emotional stable in some certain places. Do you think Scape could work on some of the underground systems to enjoy that ambient sounds as well?
I think we'd have to probably tailor it a little bit, because some of the results you can get with Scape are actually quite unsettling, and they might become the soundtrack to a sort of underground subterranean nightmare of some kind. You know, if you were already a little bit anxious about being 200 feet underground, and then you got the wrong Scape, it could be pretty bad, couldn't it? But I like the idea of generative music in public places. That was the whole idea of music for airports. The idea that you could have a way of generating constantly changing music, rather than having, you know, the cleaner bringing in their favorite CD and playing it over the whole airport sound system, which is what I heard that day in 1978. And I thought, there's got to be a better way than this. There's a gentleman wearing a tie. I respect that, so we'll have him.
Hi there. With the development of generative music apps and other software, meaning that people can generate their own music easily, how do you feel this affects the skilled composers and musicians of the future in making original music?
Okay, so this is about whether generative music does affect and how it affects musicians in the future. Well, I don't think it makes their skills redundant, for example. I mean, first of all, all of the sounds in Scape were made by musicians, me and him, using the skills that musicians have, and what's happened is that the system is a way of permutating those things. So essentially, it's like you hired a group of musicians and said, "Play this," but then you chopped it all up and allowed it to recombine in ways that it hadn't ever been combined before. So I don't think it changes much the role of musicians. It does change quite a lot the role of the composer, I think, because the composer has to move away from the... he doesn't have to. I mean, composers can do whatever they like, but this form of composition suggests moving away from the paradigm of the architect, the person who designs it in full detail, to this slightly further back position where you set the thing up and let it happen. So a composer, classical composer, finishes a piece of music. What we do is start pieces of music. They finish when you use them. And that's a different paradigm. And some composers don't want to do that, quite naturally. They want to have complete specification of the piece. They want to know exactly how it will sound. And indeed, sometimes I do. You know, there are pieces I make where I work on exactly that way, where I want to take care of every detail. But I also am excited by this idea of being able to construct a machine that makes music for me, that I can be as much an audience to as you are, you know. I'm therefore not in a particularly privileged position as a listener. I'm in the same position as any other listener. And that sort of accords with me with lots of political ideas that I find stimulating, ideas of self-organizing societies and so on and so on. That's a whole other talk, though.
I think one thing that would be interesting is if software tools for generative music evolved to a point where you could compose a generative composition as easily as we might compose a piece of music at the moment. I mean, Scape is not that. It is not attempting to be that. And I think the actual process of trying to create Scape as a generative set of processes was a very, very long and arduous one. It'd be wonderful to think sort of, oh, it'd be great if we could have this sound that did this, this, and this that responded to this. And it would just be a process of a few minutes to just describe that to something that would then make it happen. But I think we're quite away from that.
Yeah. Okay. We have to finish now. So thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.